Ok, andiamo. Buonasera a tutti. Vorrei ringraziare per cominciare tutti coloro che hanno permesso questo straordinario G20.
This G20, this extraordinary G20 possible. So I would like to start by thanking all of those people who've worked in this wonderful venue, and I would like to thank the law enforcement officers who've done an amazing job here in Rome. As you know, reaching this agreement was not easy. We can say it is a success, which we first and foremost owe to our Sherpas. In other words, to all of those who've drafted the documents which were then discussed and finally approved today. In the last few years, the G20 countries have, in fact, had difficulties in terms of working together, and this is something that we have observed over the last few years. Things have now changed, and I must say that this summit, in my view, makes me hopeful. It would appear that G20 countries are now able to tackle the key challenges that we're faced with, COVID-19, climate, health, income differences and gaps. And, of course, there are many challenges that we have understood cannot be successfully tackled alone. President Biden has stated that this summit should be remembered as a mark of success, and I will dwell upon this shortly. But we must stress that this summit comes at the end of a year during which there have been many G20 meetings. I'm not only referring to the Sherpas, but also the ministers. I would like to thank Minister Di Maio and Minister Franco, who have toiled to enable us to be here today with some results, some already known to you because they materialized over the last few months, others not. We have reformed the global taxation system to ensure that all companies pay the fair amount of taxes that they owe. This is something that was attempted time and time again for decades without success. We've ensured that poor people around the world can have access to vaccines. We have strengthened the bonds between finance and health, and this is key in order to prevent epidemics, new pandemics, and of course this is necessary in order to ensure that we are ready to face future health crises which unfortunately will materialize. We have tried to find new ways to assist the poorest countries and to find a more equitable base. We have decided to allocate 350 billion with respect to special drawing rights, as indicated by the IMF, to allocate and earmark this amount to the most vulnerable countries. There are three. Well, maybe this is something I could talk about later, but there are three forms of grants or donations that have been identified by higher income countries and that will be allocated to poorer countries. And we've also been able to play a leadership role as far as Afghanistan is concerned after the disaster that we witnessed, and President von der Leyen immediately addressed this issue and promised 1 billion euros in the form of aid to address what is becoming a truly serious humanitarian crisis, the full extent of which has as yet to be understood in our country and in other wealthy countries. And we will then obviously give you the opportunity to ask questions, but the key take-home messages are that for the first time, G20 countries have continued to commit to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade with immediate action and mid-term commitments. And then we will read the exact, let's say, wording in the final statement in the communiqué. As far as coal is concerned, global public funding in supporting non-abated coal-fired plants will be phased out after the end of this year. As far as the first point is concerned, let us take stock of the situation before our summit, and for the first time in our G20 communiqué, all countries recognize the scientific validity of the 1.5 degrees centigrade target and not the 1.52 degrees that was indicated in Paris. And the wording is such that there is, let's say, a commitment to continuing to pursue this goal. With regard to CO2 or carbon neutrality, in the past, there was no collective commitment, whereas now we are stating that this target should be met by around 2050. And obviously, this means that we have to make progress towards this target, and this is something that was not envisaged in the past, so there will be no additional net emissions by that date. Finally, there is a promise. The promise of allocating 100 billion per annum to the lowest income countries for, let's say, climate-related activities, $100 billion per annum. And there was a lot of talk about the fact that G20 countries were far from having reached this goal. This is not true. We're talking about 82, 83 billion, and a proposal made by France, which we support, indicates the possibility of using a further allocation of special drawing rights to make up for the shortfall. In any event, Italy has today announced its commitment, $1.4 billion euros, sorry, says the Prime Minister, dollars every year for 5 years, totaling 7 billion, if I have done my arithmetic properly. Minister Franco, please correct me if I'm wrong, 7 billion confirmed. So we're very proud of this achievement, but we must also stress that this is only the beginning. The health crisis, the climate crisis, global poverty, malnutrition, gender and generation gaps and inequalities require, let's say, greater effort than what we have been able to achieve so far. And President Biden, and I quote him again, has said that we will remember this as being a successful summit. In what way? Well, we have been successful because we have been able to keep our dreams alive, and we have also committed to introducing additional measures and allocating additional and considerable amounts of money, and this is success. whatever way you look at it, because it seemed that emerging countries were reluctant to take on other commitments. But we should not forget, as activists, especially young ones, remind us that we will be judged on the basis of our actions and not our words. And so we have collectively undertaken to be more concrete and to be more, let's say, committed to delivering on our promises. And this is all from me, and I'm available to answer your questions. We will start with a question from RAI, the Italian National Broadcasting Company. Mario Di Pizzo, good afternoon. You have just described the various steps that are to be made with respect to, let's say, tackling global warming. You have said that we will be judged on the basis of our actions. Is there a sense of urgency, therefore? And what do you expect the Glasgow conference will be able to deliver? Well, we've made progress with respect to the ministerial summit in Naples as far as our commitment to tackle climate change. There is a sense of urgency. All have understood this, and we can also actually once again stress the fact that the 1.5 degree let's say limit is considered to be scientifically valid, and there's also an undertaking not to implement emission policies that are, let's say, in contrast with the collective commitment that we have once again reiterated. We know that obviously many important things have been achieved since the Paris Agreement as far as limiting emissions, but we know, especially after COVID, emissions have once again risen to pre-COVID levels. Consequently, there is some concern that requires that we, as I said, deliver on our promises, and that is fundamental in order to be credible. A question from the international press. Silvia Amaro, CNBC.
Grazie mille, Prime Minister. You've said that you're more hopeful about multilateralism, but your colleagues from China and Russia, they didn't show up in person. So what has changed? Why are you feeling more hopeful about multilateralism? And do you consider yourself the true leader of multilateralism? Thank you.
Well, the answer to the second question, it's easy. No, I don't. But the first was actually, it was a good surprise, because we saw countries that we thought that had been quite reluctant to move along the lines that we were sort of suggesting and pressing them to move on until a few days ago, and then they moved. And some of these moves actually took place last night with the right language, with the right, what we consider, I mean, all of us consider the right language. And again, I should thank the Ambassador Mattiolo, because he masterminded all the workers of all the Sherpas' work to this extent. So it was, something has changed. I think and what's changed is the assessment that without cooperation, we go nowhere on issues like climate, on issues like health, on issues like poverty. We go nowhere. And the form of cooperation we know best is multilateralism. And we know best because we have rules. And these rules have been written a long time ago, and they granted us a long period of prosperity. Some of these rules ought to be changed now, it's quite clear, but the way to change these rules is to do it together. And that's where I think things have improved and have changed. Thank you.
Ileana Sciarra for ABN Kronos. Good afternoon. Today, our Pope made an appeal to COP26 to listen to our cry of pain. Do you think that we will be able to respond to this appeal and that these results may be hopeful also for the results of COP26? And do you think that Pope Bergoglio was an ally of our G20 meeting here? Well, Pope Bergoglio is not just an ally of our G20 meeting, he's an ally regarding climate and the preservation of the earth. We all remember the Laudato Si encyclical letter, where he illustrates his vision. And that's why I think that our G20, within our limited abilities, followed exactly that direction that was pointed to by the Pope. And thinking back to all the speeches we heard today, there's an actual concern about other people's and other nations' actions and an awareness of the fact that what we're doing now is for future generations. There's a question now from Handelsblatt, Christian Merke.
A clear commitment to climate neutrality with a fixed date is missing in the final declaration. What is also missing is a binding date for the end of coal power. Why couldn't we achieve stricter and binding goals? And what role did India and China play in these discussions? Thank you. Grazie.
Well, today we reached one goal, that is to say, to terminate financing of unabated coal. To go beyond, well, we also I think got some commitment to, not very clearly but very likely, to sort of keep new coal using plants to a limited extent, and I should say that both China and India were, in a sense, more willing to move toward these goals. As I've said a moment ago, the fact that they are recognizing now, we have a common ambition now, which we didn't have before. And this common ambition is well clearly formulated in the number of degrees that we have to respect as an objective, as a target, by the amount of money that we give, by the fact, by the way, there is one thing that's been, it's actually quite important in the work done by the finance track, so by the finance ministers. For the first time in a G20 document, or even actually in a G20 communique, at paragraph 30 of the communique, we speak of carbon pricing mechanism. It's never been done before. It says such a policy mix for, it says such, so we asked the different G20 work streams to act in synergy with their respective mandates and to achieve all these objectives, to avoid duplication, to actually design and identify appropriate policy mix towards low greenhouse gas emissions economies, etc. Such policy mix should include lots of things, and then, if appropriate, the use of carbon pricing mechanisms and incentives while providing targeted support for the poorest and the most vulnerable. What it seems to have been the moving factor in the negotiation is the fact that perhaps this too is the first time, is the fact that any progress with respect to previous language and previous results by the countries that produce most greenhouse emissions coming from coal any progress being combined with the promise of support and help by the rich countries. I think that's another instance where I think both China and Russia moved from their positions. Thank you.
Buonasera, Presidente.
From the Daily
Ha detto poco fa il
Repubblica. I'm over here. Prime Minister, good evening. Good evening.
dell'ONU poco fa, mentre accolgo con favore l'impegno.
Secretary General Guterres said, even though I welcome the G20 commitments, my hopes haven't been entirely dashed, but there still are some, let's say, unrealized ambitions. I imagine that the reference is being made to China. Maybe China has not, let's say, been sufficiently ambitious as far as climate goes, and I'm wondering whether perhaps this is due to the fact that we don't have public pressure in China. I mean, we can't imagine a sort of Chinese equivalent of Greta Thunberg. Well, actually, as I said, I expected China to have a more rigid position. If anything, we have seen a change, and in fact, there is readiness to accept a rather more forward-looking, let's say, approach and wording, far more so than was the case when the Paris Agreement was drafted. And China and Russia have recognized that there is scientific evidence for that 1.5 degrees centigrade target, and obviously there is a need for all of our countries to work towards limiting emissions to, let's say, avoid that temperatures could rise above that. We know that China produces approximately 50% of global steel, and many of these steel mills are coal-fired. So obviously action there means converting these steel mills, and this obviously means also adapting the steel production process. So this means that the transition required is quite challenging. And this helps us, I think, understand why there is, let's say, no commitment to more ambitious targets. I don't think public opinion has much to do with this. I believe that there is widespread difficulty to accept, let's say, the environmental conditions in that country. So actually, I think we can conclude by saying that until today, we did not share the same ambitions. Today, we share all of the ambitions and targets. Certainly, we could do more in the future, but at least some significant points are, let's say, the focus of a common approach. And there will, of course, have to be further action. Please bear in mind that during part of our summit, we also focused on the contribution that the private sector can make. And there are some, let's say, initiatives to develop public-private partnerships. Some of these initiatives actually were launched in the past few months. But what is really clear is that money is not the problem. The public sector is doing an awful lot, but it can't do everything, and the funding available in the private sector amounts to several $1 trillion, and there is considerable interest on the part of the private sector, which is keen to take part in these initiatives. So a substantial part of our effort will involve aligning public policies with the incentives that can encourage the private sector's involvement. There are many examples of this kind, such as in the UK, and this is something that we're really focusing on. Miles Johnson, FT.
Prime Minister, yesterday you said multilateralism is the best answer to the problems we face today. Based on what we have seen this weekend, on global taxation and on climate. Is the multilateralism we have seen here going to be enough? You are known around the world for having said you would do whatever it takes to save the euro. Did G20 leaders this weekend do enough, whatever it takes, to halt climate change?
Well, it's the G20 leaders have taken substantial commitments to do what they can do now. It's easy. Let me put it this way: it's easy to suggest difficult things. It's very, very difficult to actually execute them. What the G20 have done yesterday and today and throughout the year, because as you said, the agreement on minimum taxation is an extraordinary result that couldn't be reached other than in a multilateral context. So what they're doing today is a step forward in a long and difficult transition. Do we know exactly what the final goalposts of this transition are going to be? We don't. So we go step by step. We have new scientific evidence, so it's very important that we accept it with urgency. We don't deny it. And so we had a step forward to that extent. It's also important that countries gradually take stock of what is feasible as far as transition from coal plants and coal mines to other sources, other production of energies, to renewables. Third, the more we go and the more we act together, the more ideas keep on popping up, especially as far as technology transfer. You've seen, I mean, over the last, 12 months, how many new projects for the design and building of renewable sources of energy, and how many ideas have popped up even during these last 2 days of suggestions of investment in India and in other countries in renewables. The reserves of some of these countries in renewables are extraordinary. What they need and what they want is investment. So I am profoundly optimistic, provided we keep the capacity to work together. What is clear, and it's become even clearer in the last 2 days, is that if we keep this capacity, we move forward. If we start fighting and basically arguing, we go nowhere. We go nowhere. Thank you.
Una domanda da Paolo Valentino. Paolo.
A question from Paolo Valentino. Good evening, Prime Minister. Good evening. My question actually ties up with my colleague's question. You obviously spoke in favor of this new multilateral global order. So how can you reconcile this strategy that you have just described very clearly and increasing confrontation that we see around the world, particularly between the United States and China? Oh, well, I can say that, I mean, it makes perfect sense because this is the only possible approach that we can have. I mean, we were talking about the importance of working together. And of course, that is because we realize this. Certainly, there are parts of the world where tensions are still considerable, but that is nothing new. Let us go back to when these rules were drafted immediately after the Second World War. I mean, there were always tensions year after year. That notwithstanding, we were able to overcome them. So why is it that one should think that we're not going to be able to overcome the signs of tension that we see today? To give you an example, I cannot, of course, say what the outcome will be, but there is a New Yorker story that was published a couple of years ago on the relations between China and the United States, and the idea was fight, fight, talk, talk. That is the idea, but this really happens everywhere. There are tensions. If obviously we can continue to commit to working together, we can address this. And the last UN General Assembly, I must say that setting aside all of the declarations and controversies, this was a very clear commitment. Marco Galluzzo, Corriere della Sera. Good evening. I'm over here. And I would like to go back to the previous question and something you have said. In the last few weeks, you have said that we cannot go it alone and that we can successfully tackle global challenges if we act together. There are many international institutions, the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, they were all established after Bretton Woods. Do you think that there is the need for new organizations, new institutions today, given that the challenges are different? And you have indicated and repeated just now the need to bring on board the private sector to address a global climate challenge. Would you say that multilateral international institutions are still relevant today? Well, I would say so, absolutely. But of course, these multilateral international institutions have to adapt to changing times, and this happens. They have changed and are changing some of the basic rules which guide their operation. In other cases, you need more radical reform, and I'm referring to the World Trade Organization specifically. And this is something that we had realized quite a while ago. However, there was the belief a few years back, I will not add anything further, there was the belief a few years back that change had to be implemented unilaterally. A country would introduce some new taxes or duties, another country would respond, setting aside the WTO, whereas there is a new vision. There's agreement on duties between the European Union and the United States. And then there was also an agreement regarding the Boeing-Airbus question. So we have, in fact, been able to address a source of considerable concern. And as we know, this then spills over from trade, finance to geopolitics. The impression is that in recent days and during our summit, we have been able to, let's say, leave behind us many of the discussions that characterize the Trump era. Obviously, progress has to be gradual. You can't, change everything overnight, but I think we're heading in the right direction. A question from a TASS correspondent in Rome, Vera Sherbakova.
And congratulations for this event. Great for us who love Rome and Italy. You have been discussing the pandemics, vaccines, and you confirmed a very important, ambitious target, having 70% of the world population vaccinated by the end of next year. Of course, this will require additional efforts in terms of technology transfers, donations, etc. All countries are taking part in this process of vaccine donation. And my question is about the reciprocity of the vaccination certificates and how will it work in the future? We know that in China and in Russia, their vaccines are given to poorer countries, but then they're not recognized all over the world. Thank you very much. Our commitment is to have 40% of the world population vaccinated before the end of this year and 70% by mid-22. This is a huge commitment. What should we be thinking of in particular? The production of vaccines is certainly sufficient by now. The amounts available are large and keep growing. What is lacking is the ability to deliver these vaccines to the right places and to the right persons. It's a logistical issue, and this is very important. And to this purpose, the G20 group supports COVAX, launched other systems like the A Accelerator. And then the third question is, how can we have vaccines produced where they need to be used, for instance, in Africa? The WTO will be discussing this issue on the basis of a European Commission proposal to allow the countries which need these vaccines to produce them on the spot. And then, of course, there's a money problem, a problem of investments. Let's assume that this can be done, that logistics work. Well, then these plants will have to be built, the technology will have to be transferred to the countries which need it. So these are the various stages that we have to overcome one by one. But there's a commitment. There's a commitment to proceed towards this end. The 70% target by mid-22 has been confirmed by all. And now there's a question from Serenella Mattera, ANSA. Good evening, Prime Minister. The final declaration of this summit regarding the zero emissions target states that this target should be achieved by mid-century. Recently, Boris Johnson said that going beyond 2050 would be a failure, while Foreign Minister Lavrov said that Moscow confirms its target being 2060. Well, these seem to irreconcilable conditions. Well, if we think of what was happening before this meeting, well, the communiqué tends towards 2050. It's not a specific commitment. It will be 2050. But before this, there was no commitment at all. There was a general language, maybe before the end of the century. This language today is full of hope, and it is shared by countries which so far had been saying, no, we will discuss this by the end of the century. Of course, there's, mutual adjustments, changes in paper, but gradually things happen de facto. If all countries had confirmed 2050, well, things wouldn't change. I think that slowly we will get there. I have two more questions. Jason Horowitz, The New York Times, and Andrea Bonini, Sky.
Thanks, Mr. Prime Minister. Hi.
Jason.
Can you assess the role Italy has played in the talks during the summit, ideally with concrete examples? And do you think Italy has had more international influence this year than in previous recent meetings? And if so, why? And can you assess your own working relationship with President Biden these days and how important that relationship is for Europe over the next few years? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, what Italy's done in the summit, actually, I should say what Italy's done for a whole year before the summit. Many of the results we talked about today, the international agreement on taxation, the various results on there are several things that have been achieved in the finance track and in the foreign affairs track. So the last 2 days have been crucial to crystallize over what's been achieved and to move forward with the commitments in climate especially. So what's happened here is that the COP26 will build on a pretty solid foundation now. As I said, with respect to what it was before, we changed the language, the goalpost now, 1.5 is now universally agreed. Before it wasn't. The carbon neutrality around 2050 has been agreed, so meaning no net emissions, no additional net emissions. Before there was no commitment whatsoever. We're talking about the end of the century. The 100 billion a year, as we are approaching it, and on that there is a new possibility of using the SDR allocation to match the remaining difference between what it is today, which is around 83, 84 billion, 82, 84 billion, and 100. But we may have additional pledges over the coming days. It's, I think, the deadline for pledging money is November 12th, something like that. So we still have a few more days. And I'm not sure that the current figure that I gave you, 82, 84, includes the pledge by Italy. And so the other thing, as I said, is the first time that we talk about carbon pricing in a G20 communique. I think these are four issues where Italy and everybody's worked to this communique has done a lot of work to this extent. Also, the other thing that Italy has done over the last 2 days is try to understand the others' viewpoints. The fact that certain countries are reluctant to move, there is a reasoning behind this. The developing countries are saying, you, rich countries, have polluted a lot. We are in this mess because of you. When you were already polluting about 30, 40 years ago, we did 0 emissions because we were too poor. So how do we square this? Do you want to finger point me for not moving ahead with the same speed as you do? Forget. So if we enter into this fighting climate, we go nowhere. So we ought to listen and understand the others' viewpoints, but keep alive our ambitions and share them with them. And that's what Italy's done over the last 2 days in our conversations with India, with Russia, with China, and so on. I think that's the role we try to play. Now, I hope, it seems to have made a difference. At least that's what I wish to think. Thank you.
Andrea Bonini?
You mean this enormous international influence that we are having today with respect to the past? That's well, I'm not sure we do. I have no idea of making comparison. I have no sense. I don't think, at least it's not a question I'm asking myself today. We just have to go ahead and work for the common good. Thank you.
C'è l'ultima domanda da Andrea Bonini.
Last question, Andrea Bonini. Good evening. And as you know, the climate issue was considered as being, let's say, the fundamental topic that would then be addressed by COP26, and President Macron has said that COP26 is going to have to, let's say, pick up from where this summit ends, and what is required for the COP26 to be as successful as the Rome summit has been. Well, first of all, I would like to wish Prime Minister Johnson and the COP26 success. Obviously, I think we still have room to make progress on the different issues that we have been discussing. Certainly, we will hear about the private sector's contribution in the area of climate finance, and from what we understand, we're talking about huge sums of money, 100, 120, 130, 140 trillion dollars. So these are obviously figures that call into play the role of governments that will have to put in place policies in support of transition, knowing that funding is not a problem. Certainly, public funding, which will continue to be made available, is already without precedent. However, the public sector has also shown that it is capable of using mechanisms that had never before been used in the field of climate. They'd been used for tackling the debt crisis or for stabilizing the economies of emerging countries during crises. IMF and the World Bank, until recently, did not, let's say, get at all involved in these climate-related forms of funding, whereas all are now looking to the climate. The private sector can do the same, multiplied by factor of X, provided that carbon pricing policies, incentives, public funding policies, technological investment policies, and technology transfer policies from the rich to the poor countries actually are all aligned with these objectives. At that point, the mass of resources that can be mobilized is huge. Thank you very much, Mr. Draghi, and this is the end of our press conference. I will be seeing many of you in Glasgow tomorrow, and thank you once again for your outstanding work.